Some say the ocean keeps its own ledger, and every gift it gives must be repaid in blood. This is the story of the calabash that heals any wound, quenches any thirst, and kills everyone who drinks from it. If you love chilling African folklore and spine-tingling curses, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next tale. Give this video a like and drop a comment telling me, would you drink from the cursed calabash? Chapter 1. Ayo, first of the keepers. The storm came in the night, a wild and living thing, with a temper older than the city itself. Kisiwa's shoreline was no stranger to tempests, the kind that roared in with such violence that even the gulls tucked themselves into cracks in the cliffs. But this one was different. The wind had a scream to it, not the usual howl, but a scream that rose and fell like a voice that could not stop telling its story. Ayo lay on his thin sleeping mat in the corner of his mother's hut, listening to the roof strain and snap under the wind. The smell of wet salt drifted in through the gaps in the door, heavy and raw, like the ocean had climbed halfway on the land and meant to stay there. The next morning, the city woke to ruin. Fishing boats were splintered on the rocks like broken toys. The market square was a skeleton of scattered baskets, crushed stalls, and drifting debris. And on the sand, the sea had laid out its gifts and its bodies. The shore after the storm. Ayo's father had taught him that after a storm, the beach told stories. Walk slow, his father used to say. The ocean's tongue is clever. It leaves what it wants you to see. Since his father's canoe had not returned from the last season's squall, Ayo had taken to walking the rack line alone, scavenging rope, bits of sail, fish still twitching, enough to sell. This morning the sky was a pale, bruised yellow, the kind of light that made everything look like it was happening in a half-forgotten dream. Waves still rolled in hard, as if the storm had only been called away temporarily and might decide to finish its work. Ayo picked through the debris with a practiced eye, a half-useful oar, a cracked jar, a child's sandal. He had learned not to think too much about such finds the ocean gave without explanation and took without apology. Then he saw it. The find, half buried in the wet sand, about 20 paces from the waterline, was a gourd. Not the pale, rough kind used for carrying water to the fields, but a deep honey brown, its surface polished smooth as if it had been handled for 100 years. The patterns carved into it were unlike anything he'd seen in Kisiwa. Spirals that seemed to move when the light shifted, lines that curled into shapes like eyes, and waves that looked ready to spill out of their own edges. When Ayo bent to pick it up, it was heavier than it should have been, as if it were carved from wood instead of grown from a vine. And it was warm. Not sun-warm, the storm's clouds still smothered the sun, but body-warm, as though it had been carried close to someone's chest moments before being placed here. The moment he touched it, seawater spilled from its mouth. Ayo dropped it in surprise. The water steamed in the cool morning air, and the smell was strange sweet, like sugar cane boiled too long. The first sip. He should have left it there. He should have taken it straight to the elders. But Ayo had been living on the edge of hunger since the storm that took his father, and when you are hungry enough, curiosity feels like an answer. He scooped the warm water into his hands and drank. It was unlike any water he had ever tasted. Soft, heavy somehow, but not unpleasant. It rolled down his throat like silk and left a strange brightness on his tongue, like the air after lightning. Almost instantly, he felt stronger. The ache in his legs from walking the storm's wreckage faded. The stiffness in his back loosened. He drew in a deep breath, and for the first time in months, it felt as though his lungs could hold the whole horizon. The market. The next day, Ayo went to the market with the calabash tucked under his arm. He poured its water into a jar and sold it to a merchant known for his sharp tongue and sharper bargaining. The merchant drank, paused, and then laughed a loud surprise sound. Boy, this is the sweetest water I've ever tasted. By the afternoon, word had spread. Sailors came from the docks to try it. Traders stopped on their way to the city gates. A woman bought 2 jars and said her sick husband sat up in bed for the first time in a week after drinking it. By the end of the week, Ao had made more coin than in the past 3 months combined. And still, no matter how much water he poured from the calabash, it remained full. The first death. It began quietly. The old basket weaver who had bought the first jar from Ao died in his sleep. No one thought much of it. She had been frail for years. But then the dock worker who had been seen laughing and lifting barrels the day before collapsed on the pier. A child drowned in a shallow pool behind her family's hut. The deaths came one by one at first, then faster, and though no one said it out loud, Ao began to notice a pattern. Every person who had drunk from the calabash's water or lived in the home of someone who had was dead within days. He told himself it was coincidence. The storm had weakened the city. Illness was common. The sea took as it pleased. But at night he dreamed of faces bloated and pale, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths spilling black water. The warning. On the seventh day, as the market was winding down and the smell of frying plantains drifted in from the food stalls, an old woman approached his stall. She wore a string of coral beads in her hair and leaned heavily on a carved walking stick. Her eyes were sharp, and they did not look at him so much as through him. "You think the calabash feeds you," she said, "but it is feeding from you." Ao frowned. "It's just water." "It's never just water," the woman said. She leaned closer, and he could smell salt on her skin, as though she had just stepped out of the sea. "It belonged to the drowned king, a man who bargained with the ocean for power. He fed it lives, and it fed him wealth. When he died, the calabash carried on his work. It waits for a keeper, and it always finds one." She turned to leave, then looked back over her shoulder. "When it is full, it will take you too." The attempt. That night, Ao decided to get rid of it. He carried it to the shoreline, the moonlight silvering the waves. The tide was high and restless, the foam curling like claws at the sand. He waded in waist deep and hurled the calabash as far as he could. The next morning, it sat just outside his door, dry and warm, as though it had been waiting there for hours. He tried again, walking 2 miles down the coast and tossing it into the deepest water he could find. He returned home to find it in the same place. The third time, he smashed it against a rock until the rock cracked and his hands bled. The calabash was unmarked. The last night. By the end of the week, more people were dead. His neighbors no longer greeted him. Mothers pulled their children away from him in the street. That night, the wind rose again, though there was no storm. The water inside the calabash turned black, swirling slowly. Faces rose to the surface, every soul it had taken. They spoke in unison, their voices low and hungry. "It is time." Ao tried to run, but the calabash grew heavier in his arms with each step until he collapsed on the sand. The black water spilled over his chest, and the last thing he saw before the world went dark was a pale crown forming on the waves. At dawn, the fishermen found him on the shore, his skin pale and bloated, the calabash nestled in his arms like a sleeping child. By noon, it was gone. Chapter 2. Zara the glassmaker. The city remembered Ao only in whispers. In the markets, his name was avoided, replaced by a cautious, "That boy, you know." Fishermen spat in the sand before speaking of him, as though the act could keep the sea from hearing. The calabash had vanished into the tide, into rumor, into whatever place curses go when they are between keepers. Life in Kisiwa moved on as it always did. The sea took, the sea gave, and the city learned to act grateful for both. Zara was a glassmaker, a woman of fire. Her kiln was her kingdom. She worked with molten glass the way a skilled weaver works with thread pulling, twisting, shaping until the fire cooled and left something that could outlive her. Her workshop stood near the spice market, its walls blackened from years of smoke. The air there was thick with a mingled sense of clove, cinnamon, and hot sand. People often paused to watch her work. A young woman with sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair wrapped in a faded indigo scarf, eyes reflecting the same glow as the furnace. Zara's family had once been wealthy traders, But bad seasons and worse debts had stripped them of everything except the workshop and the skills her father had taught her before fever took him. Now she worked day and night to keep her mother fed and to pay the healer tending to her younger brother, Omar. Omar's cough was the kind that came from deep in the ribs, tearing at him with every breath. The healer's powders dulled the pain, but did little to stop the sound that kept Zara awake long after the kiln's fire had died. The stranger at the door. It was during the hottest month, when the air itself felt like a wet cloth draped over the city, that Zara found the calabash. She had been working late into the night, shaping delicate bottles for a spice merchant. The streets outside were quiet, the usual clamor of the market stilled by the oppressive heat. She was leaning over her workbench when a shadow crossed the doorway. "Closed!" she called, not looking up. Something thudded softly onto the bench beside her. She turned and saw it the gourd, deep honey brown, carved with spirals and eyes that seemed to blink when she moved her head. It was warm, not just from the heat of the kiln, warm in a way that felt alive. "Where did you get this?" she asked. But the doorway was empty. Whoever had brought it was already gone. The first gift. Zara turned the calabash in her hands. It was heavier than it should have been, and when she tilted it, warm liquid sloshed inside. Without thinking, she poured a little into a glass tumbler she'd made earlier that day. The water was sweet, sweeter than any she'd tasted, and it seemed to hum faintly against her teeth as she drank. An idea struck her. She carried the calabash to the room where Omar lay, his breathing shallow, his face pale in the lamplight. "Drink," she whispered, lifting the cup to his lips. He coughed once, twice, then drank deeply. Within minutes, his breathing eased. His color returned. He even smiled, a tired but genuine curve of the mouth that she hadn't seen in months. By morning, he was sitting up in bed, asking for bread, the business of miracles. Word traveled fast in Kisiwa, especially when it concerned something miraculous. Within days, neighbors were knocking at Zara's door, each with a request: water for a sick mother, for a wounded husband, for a child who hadn't spoken in weeks. She gave freely at first, but people began leaving coins on her workbench, or returning with spices, cloth, even gold bangles. Her glass orders doubled, not because people suddenly needed more bottles, but because they wanted an excuse to see her, to buy from her, to perhaps leave with a little of that sweet water. The calabash never emptied. No matter how many jars she filled, it remained warm, heavy, and full. The ledger of the dead. It was her mother who noticed first. "Have you heard?" she asked one evening, kneading dough. "The spice merchant's apprentice drowned yesterday. He was a strong swimmer." Zara paused. She remembered the boy, thin, quick-witted, with a laugh that carried over the market noise. He had been one of the first to buy water for his sick sister. The next day, a neighbor's baby died in her sleep. 2 days later, the old woman who sold dried fish was found slumped over her stall, eyes open, mouth wet. Zara began to keep a list in the back of her ledger. On one side, she wrote the names of those who had drunk from the calabash. On the other, she noted the dates of their deaths. At first, she told herself it was coincidence, but the columns began to match too neatly. The bargain with herself. Omar was well, her mother was stronger. The workshop was busier than it had ever been. She told herself she could control it. She would give the water only when it was absolutely necessary, when the life saved was worth the risk. One death for one life, a fair trade. That is the shape of every bargain. And it is how every bargain begins to fail. The fire. The summer wore on. Zara's caution weakened. More people came to her door, and it was harder to say no when she saw desperation in their eyes. Then came the market fire. It began in a spice stall, a careless lamp tipping into a pile of cinnamon sacks. The heat spread faster than thought, leaping from stall to stall. Smoke billowed over the square, thick and choking. Zara grabbed the calabash and ran into the chaos. She poured its water onto the flames, and wherever it fell, the fire hissed and retreated. People cheered as she moved through the market, scattering sweet steam in her wake. But by the time the fire was out, 6 people lay dead, not burned, but drowned. Their bodies were wet, their faces pale, as though they had been pulled from the bottom of the sea. The farewell. That night, Zara sat alone in the workshop. The calabash rested on the bench, warm and patient. She thought of Omar's laughter, her mother's smile, the new kiln she had been able to build. She thought of the boy who had drowned, the fish seller, the nameless dead from the fire. She wrapped the gourd in burlap, carried it to the edge of the city, and left it under the stone archway of the old well. "Choose a new thief," she whispered. "I am done stealing." In the morning, the calabash was gone. Chapter 3. Qasim the Smuggler. By 1912, Kisiwa City had changed. The old spice docks had been replaced by a new pier of concrete and steel, built by the colonial administration to bring progress, which meant higher taxes, stricter controls, and new laws about what could be traded, when, and by whom. For men like Qasim, progress was just another word for opportunity. The man in the mangroves. Qasim was known along the coast as a man who could get you anything. Salted dates from the far desert, he could have them on your table by nightfall. Gunpowder from the mainland, delivered in barrels marked dried fish. He had a talent for moving unseen, not because he was small. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that filled a room, but because he knew the right shadows to stand in. He was a smuggler, yes, but one with his own rules. He did not run weapons to men who would use them on their own people. He would not touch the opium the colonials were flooding into the port. And he never, ever cheated a friend. But friendship was a rare coin in those days, and Qasim's pockets were lined more with secrets than with loyalty. The storm run. It was on a storm run one of those nights when the rain comes sideways and the mangrove creeks turn to black mirrors that Qasim found the calabash. His crew had just unloaded crates of tea smuggled past the customs officers when a box slipped from the hands of a young deckhand and fell into the mud. Qasim cursed, wading in to retrieve it before the tide could claim it. The crate was lighter than it should have been, and when he pried it open, it held no tea at all. Just a single gourd, deep honey brown, its carved eyes glistening in the lamplight. It was warm, even in the cold rain. The first taste. Curiosity was a dangerous thing for men like Qasim, but in the mangroves, with the tide rising and the air thick with salt and secrets, he gave in. He tipped the gourd to his lips. The water inside was sweet, almost intoxicating. A warmth spread from his throat to his fingertips, and the fatigue of the long night evaporated as though it had never existed. By the time he reached the safety of the dockside warehouse, he felt like he could row to the mainland and back without stopping. A smuggler's miracle. Qasim was a practical man, but he was not blind to profit. The next morning he took the calabash to a fisherman he owed money to, offering the man a drink as a gesture of goodwill. The fisherman had been coughing blood for weeks. By sundown, he was mending nets in the sun, whistling as though nothing had ever been wrong. Word spread it always did. Dock workers began to slip him coins in exchange for the captain's water. Sailors offered information, favors, entire crates of goods, just for a few mouthfuls. The calabash never emptied. Qasim's pockets grew heavy. His name carried weight in new places. The tally begins. The first to die was a tax clerk. He was found face down in the shallow water by the pier, eyes open, skin pale, as though the sea had taken him gently. Then a rival smuggler drowned in a well. A boy fell asleep under a mango tree and never woke up. Qasim noticed, of course. You don't survive in his trade without seeing the pattern in things. But the deaths were scattered. The city was dangerous, and life under colonial rule had its own brutal arithmetic. They would have died anyway, he told himself. At least I'm doing some good before it happens. The first warning. One evening, as the tide crept in and the gulls wheeled low, an old woman appeared at the warehouse door. She wore coral beads in her hair and had the kind of eyes that made you feel as though your entire life was being weighed in silence. You've drunk from it, she said. Qasim narrowed his eyes. From what? The calabash. Her gaze dropped to where it rested on the desk beside him. It belonged to the drowned king. It does not serve you. You serve it. And when it is done, it will take you. Kasim chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Lady, I've served worse masters. She didn't smile. This one will keep you until you cannot tell where you end and it begins. When that day comes, you will wish for a worse master. And then she was gone, as sudden as she had arrived. The debt comes due. Kasim began to dream of the mangroves. Not the mangroves he knew, but a darker place where the water was black and still, and pale hands reached from below the surface. When he woke, the calabash was always warm, as if it had been cradled in those hands all night. Then the soldiers came. It was just before dawn when they surrounded the warehouse, rifles gleaming in the first light. Someone had betrayed him. Kasim's crew scattered, but he stayed, the calabash in his hands. He lifted it, not knowing exactly what he meant to do. The water inside turned black, and as he tipped it forward, the soldiers' eyes went glassy. Without a word, they turned and walked into the mangroves, disappearing into the still, dark water. Kasim stood alone in the silence that followed, his heart pounding. He had saved himself, but the price was already moving toward him. The last night in the mangroves. That evening, Kasim visited his mother. She was sitting on the porch, shelling beans. Stay the night, she said. It's not safe in the city now. He smiled and promised he would, but his mind was elsewhere. The calabash felt heavier than usual in the satchel at his side. When he woke the next morning, his mother's bed was perfectly made, her scarf folded neatly on the pillow. She was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just gone. Kasim left the calabash on the porch and walked away without looking back. By nightfall, it had vanished. Chapter 4, Mariamu the Midwife. By 1939, the world beyond Kisiwa City was bracing for war, though here the whispers of global turmoil arrived only as rumors carried in the holds of ships. In Kisiwa, life still followed the rhythms of tide and trade, birth and burial, and no one knew those rhythms better than Mariamu Wangala, the city's most respected midwife. A keeper of life. Mariamu was a woman of soft hands and a voice that could calm even the most terrified first-time mother. Her hair, streaked with silver, was always wrapped in a white scarf, and her eyes carried the steady patience of someone who had seen both the first breath and the last sigh more times than she could count. Her home sat near the narrow path that led from the market to the fishing docks. It was a modest place, its front room always smelling faintly of camphor and the crushed leaves she used in her medicines. The walls were lined with calabashes, gourds, and jars, each with a purpose. But the calabash that arrived in her life that year was not one she had chosen. The arrival. It was a Tuesday, hot and thick with the smell of fish drying on racks by the shore. Mariamu had just returned from delivering the child of a merchant's wife when she found something sitting neatly on her doorstep. A burlap bundle tied with a strip of faded red cloth. She glanced up and down the street, but no one lingered. When she untied the cloth, the burlap fell away to reveal a gourd, unlike any in her collection. Deep honey brown, polished smooth, carved with spirals and eyes that seemed to blink when the light shifted. It was warm. Inside, she heard the faint slosh of liquid, named the first use. 2 nights later, she was called to the home of a fisherman's wife in difficult labor. The child was stuck, the mother's breathing shallow and ragged. Mariamu had done everything she knew: herbs, massage, even the whispered prayers her grandmother had taught her, but nothing worked. Her hand fell to the new calabash, which she had left in her satchel almost without thinking. She poured a little of its warm, sweet water into a cup and pressed it to the mother's lips. The change was immediate. The woman's breathing eased, her grip on Mariamu's hand relaxed, and within minutes the child slid into the world, crying strong and loud. Mariamu wrapped the baby, the gourd still warm at her side. A pattern emerges. From that night on, Mariamu began carrying the calabash to every birth. If a mother weakened, she gave her a sip. If a newborn's first cry faltered, she dabbed the sweet water on its lips. And it worked every time. Word spread quickly. and soon women from as far as the inland hills came to Kisiwa to give birth under Mariamu's care. She didn't question the calabash's gift. She had seen too much suffering to turn away a miracle. But miracles in Kisiwa always came with a shadow. The deaths. It started with small ripples in the news of the city. A fisherman drowned in calm waters. An old woman slipped in her courtyard and never rose. A dock worker was found asleep at the base of the lighthouse, eyes open to the moon. Then one day, Mariamu's neighbor, a bright, laughing woman who had given birth just weeks earlier with Mariamu's help, was found dead in her bed, her face pale, her sheets damp with salt water. Mariamu told herself it was coincidence, but then it happened again and again. Every woman who had drunk from the calabash's water, or whose child had tasted it, was gone within weeks. The visit. One evening, as the sun melted into the sea, and the sky turned the color of bruised plum, a figure appeared at Mariamu's door. She was an old woman, her hair threaded with coral beads, her back straight despite her years. "You are feeding it," the woman said without introduction. Mariamu's voice was steady. "I am saving lives." The woman stepped inside without being invited, her eyes falling on the gourd where it rested on a low stool. "That water belongs to the drowned king. It does not give life without taking it elsewhere, and it always comes for its keeper in the end." Mariamu looked away. "Then I will keep it from taking me." The woman smiled faintly, as though at a child who had spoken bravely but foolishly. "It always takes what it is owed." The mass drowning. The season turned. One night, a storm rolled in fast, the kind that split the sky with white fire and made the sea itself seem to boil. A fishing crew, 12 men, was caught just offshore. In the morning, their boats washed up, empty. No bodies were found. Mariamu dreamed that night of a dark throne beneath the waves, and on it sat a figure crowned with coral and bone. Around him stood 12 men, their eyes unblinking, their faces as pale as the moon. When she woke, the calabash was warm and heavy beside her bed, letting go. She could not destroy it. She had seen what happened when others tried. There were always stories in Kisiwa about those who found it and tried to rid themselves of it. So Mariamu decided on a different path. She carried the calabash to the mosque at the center of the city and left it beneath the long wooden bench near the entrance. Dozens of feet passed it by each day. Perhaps it would find a new keeper without her hand guiding it. When she returned that evening, it was gone. She slept with both hands open that night, as if to prove to herself and perhaps to the sea that she carried nothing anymore. Chapter 5. Present-day spiral, the return. The day it came back, no one noticed. It arrived not with a storm, but with a perfect morning sun glittering on the water like coins. Gulls crying lazily above the pier, tourists crowding the beachfront cafes. The sea had been calm for days, lapping at the sand as if in apology for years of tempers. A fisherman's daughter found it first. She was walking barefoot along the tide line, collecting shells to sell to tourists, when her foot brushed something warm. She knelt expecting driftwood. Instead, she pulled from the sand a gourd deep honey brown, polished smooth, carved with spirals and eyes that seemed to blink when she tilted it. It was warm. She shook it. Liquid sloshed inside. Without thinking too much about it, she carried it back to her father's stall and placed it among the baskets of shells. By mid-morning, it was sitting on a table in the heart of Kisiwa's flea market, priced at the equivalent of $5. That was where Imani found it. Imani's first day in Kisiwa. Imani was not from here. She had grown up inland, where the air smelled of iron and dust, and the horizon was a flat, unbroken wall of heat. The sea had always been a distant story to her, something you saw on postcards or in films, never in your own life. Now she was here with a camera, a grant from a small arts foundation, and an idea for a documentary called Water That Remembers. It was meant to be a meditation on coastal communities, water myths, and how stories survive over generations. She was filming in the market, capturing the chaos of it, the vendors calling out their prices, the smell of fried plantain mixing with raw fish, the bright bolts of cloth snapping in the breeze when she saw the calabash. It sat alone on a cracked wooden table, between a rusted lantern and a stack of chipped enamel bowls. Something about it pulled her eye, the way certain things in antique shops seem to lean toward you without moving. The purchase. How much? She asked the stall owner, a man with a wide straw hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Special price for you, he said, as if he said that to everyone. 1,000 shillings. She laughed. That's $5. Yes, for you. It is. Good luck. Imani didn't believe in luck, but she believed in props. An old carved gourd would be perfect for a segment on traditional water vessels. She paid without bargaining, slipped it into her tote bag, and moved on. She didn't notice the stall owner making a small sign with his fingers as she walked away, a gesture meant to ward off something. The first sip. That evening, back at her rented apartment above a bakery, Imani unpacked her bag. The calabash was still warm, though the sun had set hours ago. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the spirals with her thumb. Out of habit, she sniffed it sweet, faintly floral. She tilted it, expecting it to be empty. Instead, a clear golden liquid poured into the small glass she kept on the counter. It didn't smell like any tap or bottled water she knew. She took a sip. The taste was strange, sweet but not cloying. Light but with a weight to it, like honey thinned with rain. And instantly a wave of clarity washed over her. The headache she'd been nursing all day from the heat vanished. The soreness in her back from carrying her gear was gone. She felt awake in a way coffee never gave her. The miracle. The next morning she was visiting her aunt, who lived in a crumbling apartment block near the harbor. Aunt Salma had been sick for months, arthritis, the doctor said, and a stubborn fever that no medicine seemed to break. Imani brought her groceries and sat at her bedside. Without thinking, she poured some of the calabash's water into a mug and handed it over. Try this, she said. Her aunt drank, wrinkling her nose at the sweetness. 10 minutes later, she was sitting up, asking for more bread. By the time Imani left, Salma was in the kitchen, clattering pots like she hadn't in months. That night, Imani filmed a short video about it. This old gourd from the flea market, I think it's magic. She posted it to her small YouTube channel, mostly followed by other documentary nerds. By morning, the video had 200,000 views. Comments poured in. Where can I get that water? My grandma needs this. Please sell me some. Sis, don't mess with stuff you don't understand. Imani laughed at the last one. She didn't know that somewhere in Kisiwa, a woman with coral beads in her hair had seen the video and was already on her way to find her. Chapter 6. The first warning. The video didn't just go viral. It spread. Within 2 days, people were stitching it on TikTok, arguing in the comments about whether it was fake. A wellness blogger with 2 million followers posted, I don't know what's in that gourd, but I want it. Someone else claimed it looked like a West African healing vessel and accused Imani of cultural exploitation. Others begged her for just a single drop. Her email inbox overflowed. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. And then people started showing up. The crowd at the door. On the third day, Imani came downstairs to find 3 strangers waiting outside the bakery beneath her apartment. One was a middle-aged man in a suit, sweating through the fabric, clutching an envelope thick with cash. Another was a young woman holding a crying toddler. The last was a boy about 17, his face pale, wearing a hospital wristband. We saw your video, the man said. We'll pay whatever you want. The young woman's voice trembled. My daughter's fever won't break, please. The boy just stared at her, as if willing her to understand without words. Imani's throat tightened. I'm not selling it. I don't even know what it is. They didn't move. They just looked at her. And in their eyes was the kind of desperation that makes people do foolish, dangerous things. The first death. That evening, she gave in. She poured 3 small jars of the calabash's water, one for each of them. She told herself it was harmless, maybe even kind. The next morning, she woke to her phone buzzing. A headline was being shared in every group chat she was in. Local teen found dead near harbor. She clicked the article. The boy from yesterday. No signs of violence, no drowning. The police suspected a seizure, but the photo showed his open eyes, glazed and oddly bright. His lips tinged the faintest shade of blue. Her stomach churned. The woman in coral beads. That afternoon, while Imani was at the cafe editing footage, a shadow fell across her laptop. "You're Imani," a voice said. She looked up. The woman standing there was old but not frail. Her back was straight, her hair pulled into a thick braid, threaded with coral beads that clicked softly when she moved. Her eyes were sharp enough to cut through pretense. "Yes?" Imani said cautiously. The woman sat without asking. "You have it." Imani frowned. "Have what?" "The calabash. It was not yours to take." The warning. The cafe noise faded into a dull hum. The woman leaned in. "It belonged to the drowned king. It drinks life for every drop it gives. The more you pour, the hungrier it becomes." Imani's skin prickled. "It's just water." The woman's voice hardened. "And a fire is just heat until it burns you. You've already fed it. That boy, his name was Jamal. You gave it to him. It took him." Imani swallowed hard. "You think it killed him?" The woman nodded once. "The deaths will grow closer to you. First strangers, then friends, then blood." Imani's hands tightened on her cup. "How do you know all this?" The woman's eyes went distant for a moment. "Because I have been where you are, and I buried people I love before I learned to let it go." A choice deferred. Before Imani could speak again, the woman stood. "If you are wise, you will throw it back into the sea." "That won't stop it, will it?" Imani asked. The woman paused, her beads clicking softly. "No, but it will stop you." And then she walked out, leaving the scent of salt water in the air. The second death. That night, Imani's phone lit up with a call from Aunt Sama. But it wasn't Sama's voice on the other end. It was a neighbor. "Your aunt. I'm sorry, she's gone. They found her in the kitchen. There was water on the floor, but nothing spilled." Imani's hands shook as she hung up. The calabash sat on the table, warm and heavy. Somewhere deep inside, she thought she heard it breathe. Chapter 7. The Investigation. Imani didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with the calabash in front of her, laptop open, phone buzzing every few minutes with condolences about Aunt Sama. The messages felt unreal typed words about a reality she didn't want to face yet. The gorge seemed to radiate heat into the air between them. Every time she looked away from it, she felt the urge to look back, like it wanted her attention. The search begins. By dawn, she was scrolling through every online archive she could find. Articles on Kisiwa folklore, scanned pages from academic theses, tourist blogs about haunted coastal spots. One pattern kept surfacing, the name, the Calabash of the Drowned. It was always described the same way, honey brown, carved with spirals and eyes, never empty. In some stories, it gave food instead of water. In others, it could heal wounds instantly. But always, always there was a price. And in every version of the story, the calabash vanished after the death of its keeper, only to reappear decades later in the hands of someone new. The first thread. Zara. The oldest confirmed account she found was from the 1890s, a glassmaker named Zara, known for healing the sick with a miraculous gourd. Scrolling through the digitized records, Imani found an old black and white photo of a woman in a headscarf standing outside a kiln holding something. The image quality was bad, but Imani could make out the curve of the gourd in her hands. She clicked to the next scan, a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Mysterious Deaths in Market District." According to the article, Zara disappeared after a fire destroyed several market stalls. Witnesses claimed to have seen her walking into the smoke, carrying the gourd. She was never seen again. Imani leaned back in her chair, heart thudding. This wasn't just folklore. These were names. People. The second thread. Qasim. Next, she found records from 1912, a smuggler named Qasim. His name came up in colonial police reports. One file described him as a dangerous but charismatic figure, suspected of using unknown means to recover from injuries and illnesses that should have kept him bedridden. There was a brief, chilling note in one officer's handwriting. Do not drink from the gourd. It is not water. The last record was a missing persons report for Kasim's mother, dated 2 days before Kasim himself vanished from Kisiwa. The connection. Imani started sketching a timeline in her notebook. 1893, Zara the glassmaker vanished. 1912, Kasim the smuggler vanished. 1939, Mariamu the midwife, last sighting of the calabash before it disappeared. 2023, it's in her kitchen. She stared at the final entry for a long time. The uninvited guest. A knock at the door jolted her. When she opened it, a man stood there, tall, sharp suit, polished shoes that didn't belong on Kisiwa's dusty streets. He introduced himself as Daniel Okoro, a consultant in rare cultural artifacts. I believe you have something of interest to me, he said, his gaze flicking toward the table inside. Imani's stomach tightened. I'm not selling it. Daniel smiled faintly. Selling? No. This is more of a matter of safekeeping, for everyone's benefit. She started to close the door, but his hands shot out, holding it open. Things like this, they never stay with one person for long. There was something in his tone that made her skin crawl, not quite a threat, but not far from it either. The second death in 3 days. That night, she got a call from a friend she'd known since film school, Naya, who lived across town. I saw your video, Nia said, half laughing. Is that thing for real? I've been down with this stomach thing for days. Bring me some of that magic water? Imani hesitated, the warning from the coral bead woman still sharp in her mind. But Nia was one of her closest friends. She couldn't say no. She brought a jar over. Nia drank it all in one go, made a face at the sweetness, and laughed. Tastes like someone boiled flowers. The next morning, Nia was dead. Found in her bed, eyes open, lips tinged blue. Just like Jamal. Just like Ansama. The breaking point. Imani didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the calabash, the spirals and eyes catching the light. You're killing them, she whispered. You're killing me. For a moment, she thought she saw one of the carved eyes blink. Chapter 8. The offer. The morning after Nia's funeral, the city felt different. Not quieter. Kisiwa never truly quieted, but thinner, like the air itself was holding its breath. The market stalls seemed subdued, the colors muted under a flat gray sky. Even the gulls were fewer. Imani sat at a corner table in the cafe where she first met the coral bead woman, nursing a coffee that had gone cold. Her camera bag sat beside her, untouched. She hadn't filmed anything in days. The calabash was in her apartment, waiting. Daniel returns. Still carrying it? The voice made her flinch. Daniel Okoro slid into the seat across from her, dressed as sharply as before. His suit was a deep navy today, his shirt crisp white. Not a speck of dust dared cling to him. You're following me, she said flatly. I'm watching, he corrected, as if that made it less unsettling. And I'm here to help you. She laughed without humor. Help me? You want it for yourself. He didn't deny it. You're not equipped to handle something like this. You've already lost people, haven't you? Her silence was answer enough. The pitch. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. What if I told you there was a way to make this work? To use it without the chaos? Think about it: healing centers, exclusive clients, discreet distribution. You could change lives, save people, and make enough money to never work again. It kills, Imani snapped. That's the part you're forgetting. Daniel smiled faintly. It's not forgetting. It's managing. Every gift has a price. The trick is making sure someone else pays it. There are ways to direct it, to ensure the debt is collected from places we can afford to lose. Her stomach turned. You're talking about choosing who dies. I'm talking about control, he said smoothly. Right now, you're just a target holding a loaded weapon without knowing how to aim. I know how to aim. The temptation. She hated that part of her wanted to believe him. It would be so easy. Use the water to help, but manage the deaths so they weren't people she knew, people she loved. Push the guilt into the distance, pretend it was fate's decision, not hers. The thought made her sick, but it lingered like the smell of salt on skin. The leverage. When she didn't answer, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and slid something across the table, a small flash drive. "What's this?" she asked. "Proof," he said. "Footage of the last time it was here. Mariamu, the midwife, 1939. You'll want to see how she handled it." Imani stared at the drive. "Why give this to me?" "Because," Daniel said, standing, "when you see the truth, you'll realize you have two choices. Work with me or drown under it." He left without looking back. The drive. Back in her apartment, she plugged the drive into her laptop. The video was grainy, black and white. The sound warped. It showed a woman in a white headscarf, Mariamu, kneeling beside a crying newborn. She dipped a cloth into the calabash, wiped the baby's lips, and the crying stopped. The room cheered. The footage cut 2 weeks later. Mariamu was alone, sitting by the gourd, her face hollow. She whispered something too quiet to hear and placed a bundle of coins beside it. The final shot was of her walking out of frame. The calabash stayed in place. Slowly, the coins sank into it, disappearing without a ripple. The screen went black. The knock. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. She checked the peephole. No one. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. But on the floor sat a sealed jar of water, sweet-smelling, golden, from her calabash. She hadn't poured it. Chapter 9. The price. The jar of water sat on the floor like an accusation. Imani didn't touch it, didn't even bring it inside. She left it in the hallway and closed the door, but she could feel it there, not just the jar, but the awareness behind it. The calabash was changing the rules. The morning news. The next day, the news feeds were full of one story. 3 found dead in Harbor District. No connection between them except location. No signs of violence. All with the same pale skin, the same faint blue lips, the same open eyes. Imani's stomach turned when she read the names. 2 were strangers. One was the man in the suit who had come to her door begging for water days earlier. She hadn't given it to him, which meant the calabash had. Losing control. By mid-afternoon, she confirmed her fear. She returned from filming an interview in the old quarter to find 2 more jars on her counter, full, warm. She hadn't poured them. She hadn't even taken the calabash out of its hiding place in the cupboard. She grabbed it, shaking it in her hands. "Stop!" she shouted, the sound ricocheting off the kitchen walls. For a second, she swore the spiral seemed to twist under her fingers, the carved eyes tightening into a frown. The warmth in her palms flared, almost burning. She dropped it. The gourd rolled a little, then stopped with one carved eye staring directly at her. The call. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Imani," Daniel's voice purred. "I warned you, the longer you fight it, the more it will act for itself. It's old, older than you can imagine. It doesn't like being ignored." "I didn't pour the water," she said. "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "It's learned to feed without your hands. Soon it won't need you at all. And when that happens, you're just debt to be collected." Her throat tightened. "Then why are you still trying to get it?" "Because," he said, "I can make it need me. And if it needs me, I decide where the price is paid." The third day, she decided to lock it away. She placed it inside a heavy trunk, wrapped in blankets, shoved to the back of her closet. That night, she dreamed she was underwater. Not drowning, exactly more like hanging suspended, her body swaying with unseen currents. Around her were pale faces, eyes open, hair drifting like seaweed. They were watching her, waiting. When she woke, the calabash was on her nightstand, the death that broke her. Her phone buzzed with a message from her cousin Malik. "Something's wrong with Mom. Call me." Imani's chest went tight. She grabbed her bag and ran the 3 blocks to her aunt's house. She was too late. The paramedics were wheeling her aunt out, the sheet already pulled over her face. Malik stood frozen on the porch, His hands clenched, his eyes wide and wet. She, she just collapsed, he stammered. There was this smell in the kitchen, like flowers. I don't know. Imani's gaze slid past him to the table. On it sat a half-empty jar of sweet golden water. The breaking point. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The deaths were no longer random or distant. The calabash had reached into her bloodline. And in that moment, the last of her hesitation cracked. Daniel's words came back to her. I can make it need me. If she couldn't destroy it, and she was starting to believe she couldn't, then maybe she had to learn how to aim it before it took everyone she cared about. Chapter 10. The Trap. The meeting was set for midnight. Daniel chose the location, an abandoned shipping warehouse at the far edge of Kisiwa's industrial pier, where rusted cranes loomed like dead giants against the night sky. It smelled of salt and old oil, the kind of place where bad deals were made and no one asked questions. Imani didn't bring the calabash in her hands. It was in her backpack, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth, heavy and warm against her spine, like it had its own heartbeat. The rules of the game. Daniel was already there, leaning against a metal column, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. The smoke curled upward in the still air. You came, he said. I didn't have a choice, Imani replied. It's killing everyone close to me. That's because you haven't given it direction, Daniel said, flicking the cigarette away. It's like a current without a channel. It floods. But if you guide it, he smiled, you can irrigate a kingdom. She folded her arms. What's your real plan? His eyes glinted. Controlled distribution, rich clients, powerful clients. The calabash doesn't care who dies, only that someone does. We'll feed it strategically. People whose deaths we can use. The words were smooth, like he'd practiced them. The bait. From the shadows, 2 men wheeled out a large crate. Daniel gestured to it. This is your first lesson, he said. Inside are 12 goats, harmless creatures. We'll give them water. They'll die. It'll keep the calabash satisfied for days, maybe weeks. No humans need to die tonight. Imani's stomach churned. You've tested this before? Daniel's smile widened. Of course. The first shift. She hesitated, then opened her backpack. The calabash was warm, almost hot now. She set it on the ground between them. The spirals seemed to pulse, the carved eyes shifting toward Daniel. The goats bleated softly in the crate, as if they knew something was wrong. Daniel handed her a tin cup. Pour. She reached for the gourd and felt it resist. The weight shifted toward her, as though it wanted to stay in her hands. Her fingers tightened instinctively. Daniel's voice sharpened. Pour it, Imani. The turn. She tilted the calabash over the cup. The liquid that poured out was darker than usual, almost amber red and thicker. The smell sweet, but edged with something metallic, hit her like a wave. The goats went silent. Daniel reached for the cup, and that's when it happened. The calabash lurched in her hands, tilting sharply, sending the rest of the water splashing over Daniel's shoes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his face went slack. His pupils dilated. His breathing slowed. Imani, he croaked, before stumbling backward and collapsing onto the concrete. The lock-in. The warehouse lights flickered. Somewhere in the shadows, the goats began bleating frantically, kicking at their crate. The 2 men Daniel had brought rushed forward, but as they got within a few steps of the calabash, they froze. Imani couldn't see what they were looking at, only that their eyes widened, and then they both turned and ran for the exit. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind them. The whisper. She was alone now, alone with Daniel's still body and the gourd at her feet. The carved eyes on the calabash were no longer just paint. They seemed deep, wet, glistening. One of them blinked. A voice not in her ears but in her chest spoke. Now you see, I choose. The spirals shifted again, and she realized with cold clarity that Daniel had never been in control. Maybe no one had. Chapter 11. The Choice. The warehouse felt heavier now, the air pressing in from all sides. Daniel lay motionless on the floor, his skin pale and damp, as if he'd just been pulled from deep water. His eyes were open, but unfocused, his lips faintly blue. The goats in the crate were quiet now, too quiet. The calabash sat between Imani's feet, warm enough to feel through the soles of her shoes. The spirals seemed to turn in slow, hypnotic loops. And then she heard the voice again. You have carried me well. The realization. She remembered what the coral bead woman had told her. First strangers, then friends, then blood. She had reached the last step. Everyone she loved was either gone or within the calabash's reach. The voice slid through her thoughts like a tide. You could have everything. Wealth, power. No more loss, only gain. I can give it all. Imani's chest tightened. She knew what it wanted. She knew that if she said yes, even silently, it would wrap itself around her life until there was no her left, only a keeper. The old story. The flash drive Daniel had given her was still in her bag. She pulled it out, plugged it into her laptop, and replayed the footage of Mariamu one last time. There was something she hadn't noticed before. In the final seconds of the recording, Mariamu had lifted the calabash to her lips and stopped. Her jaw was tight, her eyes wet, but she didn't drink. She held it there, trembling, until the screen went black. The refusal wasn't weakness. It was the only blow that had landed. The ritual. She picked up the calabash. It was burning hot now, as if it knew what she intended. The spirals twisted frantically, the eyes narrowing. Drink, the voice commanded. She raised it to her lips. The scent hit her flowers. Salt, honey, something rich and ancient. It was intoxicating. Her whole body screamed for just one swallow. She tipped it, and the thick golden liquid rolled into her tongue. And she held it there. The battle. The voice in her head became a roar. The warehouse seemed to shudder. Daniel's body twitched on the floor. The goat's crate rattled violently, wood splintering. Her jaw ached from the effort of not swallowing. The liquid was warm, then scorching, then ice cold, flooding her mouth with sweetness that made her throat contract in longing. Images flashed behind her eyes, her aunt alive and laughing. Nia calling from across a cafe, her cousin Malik smiling under a warm sun. Swallow, the voice demanded, or you will lose them all. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. The break. Something in the air snapped. The calabash jerked in her hands, twisting like a living thing. She spat the liquid onto the concrete, where it hissed and evaporated instantly. The spirals slowed. The carved eyes closed. The heat bled away, leaving the gourd cold and suddenly small. A hairline crack split across its surface with a soft sound, as if the air inside it had sighed. The silence. For the first time since she'd touched it, Imani felt nothing from the calabash. No hum, no pull. Just an empty vessel. Daniel lay still, but his chest rose faint, shallow breaths. The goats began bleeding again, confused but alive. Imani knelt and set the cracked gourd on the floor. She didn't know if the curse was truly gone, but it was quiet now. Chapter 12. The aftermath. Morning light crept into the warehouse through broken windows, painting the floor in fractured gold. The calabash sat where Imani had left it, a pale crack running down one side, its once glossy surface dulled. It looked ordinary now. Harmless. The way a snake looks after you've convinced yourself it's dead. Daniel stirred, groaning, his voice rough. What happened? You lived, Imani said simply. He blinked at her, confusion clouding his eyes. The gourd. Finished, she said, though the word felt fragile in her mouth. The disposal. She didn't leave it there. By mid-morning, she had wrapped the calabash in an old fishing net and carried it to the farthest end of the pier. The air smelled of diesel and salt, gulls calling overhead. Standing at the edge, she held it over the water. The crack ran the length of it now. The spirals faded. The carved eyes shut as if in a deep, final sleep. Stay gone, she whispered, and let it drop. The gourd hit the water with a soft splash and sank without resistance. The ripples faded quickly, swallowed by the waves. For a long moment, she stayed there listening. Only the usual sea sounds reached her. No hum, no whisper. Trying to move on. Weeks passed. She finished her documentary, but not the one she'd planned. Instead of water that remembers, it became the things we feed. She cut together the history she'd uncovered: Ayo, Zara, Kasim, Mariamu, layering it with her own footage and narration. The final scene was just the sea, endless and blue. When it premiered at a small community hall in Kisiwa, the audience was silent at the end. Not unsettled, reverent. They left in small groups, speaking in low voices, as if afraid to break whatever had settled over them. The return. A month later, Imani was walking through the harbor market when she passed a stall selling shells and driftwood. Something warm brushed her ankle. She looked down. There, half buried in a basket of sea glass, was a shard of polished gourd, honey brown, carved with a single spiral in the edge of a closed eye. The vendor smiled. Pretty, isn't it? Found it washed up last week. Imani stared at it, the market noise fading around her. For a moment, she thought she felt the faintest hum in her bones. She forced a smile. It's beautiful, she said, and walked away without touching it. Behind her, the vendor hummed softly to himself an old tune about the sea taking and the sea giving as his fingers idly traced the spiral. Kiss, the end.